I always say that learning to be a good game master is a process and you're never going to start off perfectly, but I still wanted to share a couple of the top tips that I learned over the last couple years that I wish I had learned day one of being a GM. Hey fellow Game Masters, I'm Richard Quiner and welcome back to the Daily D20, your daily dose of all things tabletop role-playing games, helping you build your world and master your game. And today is Workshop Wednesday, but I wanted to do something a little different, a little more introspective, where I give you some of the tips that I wish I had learned when I just started being a GM, that I wanted to pass on to you. If you are new, these could come in handy. If you've been in this game for a while and been playing and running games, you probably know these already, but it's a nice refresher anyways. So let's get into these 5 tips. Tip number 1 for me has been communicate. Now, communication is kind of a top tip in life in general. If you can learn to communicate with people in your relationships, whether it's a girlfriend, boyfriend, husband and wife sort of relationship, or just between friends, communication is a really good thing to learn how to do. And I'm still learning how to do this myself. I'm not perfect. Like I said, nobody is. But when it comes to your games of Dungeons and Dragons, I'm not really referring to the communication at the table when you're talking about the places that your players are or during the fights that they're in, but I'm talking about out of game, or more when issues kind of come up. One of the number one killers of D&D campaigns, I believe, is the difference of expectations between the GM and the players, and between the players and the other players. There's just a whole lot of expectations going around, and it's very important that you communicate what's going on at the table, within the game, out of the game, that sort of thing, so everyone is on the same page with their expectations. If you have one player who wants to get in the game and wants to be the dungeon crawly person, who wants to just constantly be fighting, constantly going room to room, checking for traps, killing things like that, that's one way to play. But if they're at a table with someone else who wants to get into heavy emotional role-playing situations, they're not going to mesh so well. They're going to have some issues unless they talk about it beforehand and find a nice compromise. I'm a firm believer that different playstyles can work at the same table as long as there's compromise, and I think it's your job as the GM, or the tip that I want to tell you, is open communication. When someone comes to you with a problem, or if they don't come to you with a problem, if you just start seeing problems at the table, begin a dialogue and start communicating about what's happening, start communicating about play styles, different expectations, and figure out what the root cause of the issues might be, so then you can get back on track with the game and continue forward as a solid adventure party. The next tip that I have for you is define your playstyle, or find your playstyle if you haven't found it yet. This means play a lot of different ways. Play games that are more dungeon crawl, heavy combat based. Play games that are more heavier role-playing based. Play a mix of them. Play some where you travel from one end of the world to the other in an instant. Play sessions where the characters just go shopping and buy items and help them level up in their strength. Play sessions where the players are kind of at their wits' end and run out of resources, so it's always scary for them. Play a lot of different things, and if your players are up for it, you can cram a lot of these session ideas into one campaign. You don't need to start several campaigns to find your playstyle. Just start one campaign, play it, and change the playstyle session to session to find what you enjoy best and what fits with your table. And I say find what you enjoy best because you're the game master. You have to enjoy the game as much as your players do. When I'm making these videos, I always tend to explain or focus on what the players want. But just as important as what the players want is what you as the GM want. So try things out, find what's better for you, find your playstyle, and then you can go down that path and enjoy the game more fully. Tip number 3 is make the players learn their own rules. Give them some responsibility. I've heard some GMs say players should take notes, and I fully agree with that. Players should take notes at the game. And I've heard some GMs say give the players chances to track initiative and other things that are more GM-focused activities, which is all good. But the number one thing that I think players need to learn, and I'm very passionate about this, is learn your class. Learn the rules that is going to focus on that class, and you as the GM should encourage them to do that. Give them some sort of way, make the information available to them so they can learn how to play their character as best as they can. There's nothing worse than running a campaign for a year and having a player who's been playing a wizard the whole time, who then decides to cast a spell that they cast often, and they turn to you as the GM and say, "What does that do?" And you say, "Well, I have to look it up." something like that. It slows down the game and makes things kind of more boring and difficult for you as the GM, because now you're suddenly keeping track of the rule set for this one player who might not have been reading the rules or hasn't been paying attention. So give the players that responsibility. Say, hey, you need to know the rules for your character. If you're going to cast a spell, you need to know the rules for the spell that you're casting. Don't wait for the last second to learn how the spell works. Be ready for your turn in combat, help the game run better, and don't rely on the GM completely for your information. So tip number 3 as a GM is give your players responsibility, make them learn their rules, and make them learn their class. Tip number 4, I say GM for yourself. Now, what does that mean exactly? It means you need to enjoy the game as the GM as much as your players enjoy the game as the players. But you need to find a certain joy or something that you like about running a game or being a game master that will keep you entertained. If you go into preparing each session, of course you're going to focus on what your players want. You're going to design traps and cool dungeons that you enjoy as the GM, and then your players might not even encounter those things. So it can be kind of disheartening when you plan something and your players don't play it. It's a little depressing. It's sad. You feel like you wasted your time. But that's why I say GM for yourself. Be the game master for you. When you go to build your world or your dungeons, think of it as you're just building a world and you're building some dungeons, and whether or not your players find it, it doesn't matter because you've prepared it and it's for you. That's what I mean by GM for yourself. Think of what makes you happy, do more of that in your preparation or behind the scenes of the game, and then when you're actually at the table playing, it might not feel so hurtful when the players don't find something that you have made. And the last tip that I wanted to explain to you is tip number 5. It is take breaks. And I don't just mean at the game table on game night take a break, and I don't mean between sessions take breaks. I mean, if you find yourself running yourself ragged, preparing sessions, running sessions, and just getting kind of mental fatigue from the game, it's okay to tell your players we're going to take a break and stop for a couple weeks or a couple days, whatever works for you. Find yourself some me time in that, so you don't think about Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or whatever game you're playing. Just shut it off for a little bit, refresh your mind, because it is taxing to be creative all the time. It is a mental energy that you have to use, and I think a lot of GMs forget that when they start running games. And if you run a weekly session, some GMs who run weekly sessions might find that for a 4-hour session or 3-hour session, they're spending 8 to 12 hours outside of that session preparing things. And then they're sitting there trying to perform and trying to make the game interesting for their players. And then it just gets very tiring and kind of taxing on their mind and their creative energies, so to speak. So if you need it, take a break. That's a tip that I learned after running a game for about a year. I didn't really take a lot of breaks, but when I took the first break, I was like, oh yeah, this is kind of nice. I like this, and I'm going to do this when I need it, because I think it's important. And when you come back, you can come back with some energy, you can have a good creative outlook on things, and you can make a better game for your players. If you've liked this video, I invite you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right here on YouTube. Hit the bell icon next to it so you get notified when I upload the new videos, which is every day. And of course, fellow Game Masters, I've been Richard Quiner. Thank you for watching.